The lamps of the great hall burned with resinous oil. Their smoke caught in the rafters like storm clouds, while below them nobles spun across polished stone in a whirl of crimson silver and deep forest green. Laughter rang like chimes layered with the heavy rhythm of drums and the glimmering rise of flutes. Outside, autumn winds rattled the iron-barred windows, but within warmth and splendor blurred together, drowning out the memory of frost waiting in the night. Liana stood at the farthest edge of the hall, a figure as easily overlooked as the guttering candles placed near the doors. Her gown was not her own. It had been pulled from the chest of some merchant's wife, hurriedly altered so she might stand among the other Omegas. Silk shimmered under torchlight, but it clung awkwardly to her lean form, thin shoulders, lost in folds that did not belong to her. She smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, the stubborn scents of the infirmary hearth where she spent her days grinding herbs, stitching wounds, mending fevered men too poor or too broken to earn care elsewhere. Her hair had been twisted up by hurried fingers, those strands escaped and curled damply against her cheeks. Her hands, though scrubbed raw, still bore the scars of her labor. Thin white lines from knives, faint burns from boiling kettles of resin and root. No one here would notice such details, but she did. She felt them with every breath, reminders that she was not made for dancing in radiant halls, but for binding wounds in silence. The music swelled. An Alpha Lord's son spun his partner laughter sharp as wine. A lady's jewels scattered light as though she carried the stars across her throat. Omegas clustered near the rear, smiling too brightly, eager to be chosen for a dance that might lift them even for a moment from their station. Yet Liana kept to the shadows, her gaze wandering not toward the center of the floor, but toward the door, the way out the world where she could breathe again without the press of so many eyes. The announcement came with the sudden toll of bronze. The hall hushed. Lord Chum. Careth of High March approaches. The herald's voice rang out firm enough to silence the musicians. The doors swung wide, wind chasing into the chamber, scattering petals and smoke alike. And there he stood, tall shoulders draped in wolf fur, his gaze sharp as flint. His presence cut through the room like a blade through cloth. Conversation's stilled fans froze mid-air, and in that pause even the fire seemed to bow lower in its hearths. Careth's eyes swept across the hall. Alphas shifted, each measuring the weight of his glance. Betas stiffened their smiles tight with courtesy. Omegas lowered their chins, though some peeked through lashes, praying for the impossible gift of notice. And then impossibly his gaze stopped. On her. Liana felt it before she understood it. The prickle at the base of her neck, the sudden hush in her chest. He was not supposed to see her. Not amid the jewels, not amid the silk and gold. Yet the Lord's head tilted slightly wolf-sharp, as though scenting something the rest had missed. That one his voice carried resonant and cold. "Bring her to me!" The hall erupted in whispers. A dozen heads turned toward Liana, their eyes sliding from curiosity to disbelief, then to scorn. She heard her name hissed by lips that had never cared to use it before. She felt her skin burn beneath their stares. Her hands, traitorous, trembled at her sides. 2 guards stepped forward, not unkind but firm, parting the crowd, as though she were a vessel being carried toward sacrifice. The silk of her gown whispered against the floor, too heavy, too bright. Every step closer to the center felt like walking across a cliff's edge with no promise of ground below. Kareth did not move until she stood before him, trembling yet upright. His presence filled the space between them like smoke fills a lung. He looked down at her not with disdain, nor with pity, but with something unreadable, sharp as a knife, yet weighted with curiosity. "An Omega forgotten," he said softly, though the hall heard. "And yet, here you are." His words hung in the air, dangerous and heavy, like the first drop of rain before a storm. The music did not return. The whispers did not fade. Liana's world had narrowed to the pounding of her heart and the impossible truth that the Alpha Lord had pointed to her out of everyone and called her forth. What fate waited in that command she could not yet know. But the hall, the nobles, and every rival watching with narrowed eyes understood nothing for her would ever be the same again. Kareth did not offer his hand at once. He let the silence stretch taut as a bowstring testing who in the hall would break first. When at last he moved, it was with the smallest of gestures, 2 fingers turning a palm opened in command rather than courtesy. The air thickened. No one in that chamber mistook the movement for gallantry. It was possession made flesh. Liana's breath caught. Her body moved before her mind consented, trained by years of instinct to obey. The silk at her ankles tangled as she rose, and for a terrible instant she imagined herself stumbling before the gathered court, proving every whisper correct. An Omega is clumsy, forgettable, not fit to stand in the light. Yet she found her balanced spine rigid, pulse hammering. The crowd parted as she crossed the floor. Noble daughters hid their scorn behind jeweled fans, their eyes cutting sharper than knives. Lords murmured with a note of disbelief. A few, emboldened by wine, sneered openly, certain the Alpha's choice was some cruel jest. Liana walked through their doubt as though wading through icy water, each step numbing her fear into something harder, something like defiance. When she reached him, Kareth did not smile. He did not need to. He closed his hand around hers, a grip of tempered iron, and turned toward the polished expanse of the dance floor. The musicians faltered only for a beat, before strings and flutes hurried to catch him, as though the music itself bent to his will. The first measure began. His stride drew her into movement before she could recall the steps. The floor beneath their feet was a mirror of marble, reflecting chandeliers that trembled with candlelight. Liana's slippers whispered against the stone, guided by the commanding rhythm of his body. He was not gentle. Each turn was a demand, each lift of her arm an assertion of dominance, but he was precise, and he never let her falter. Around them, voices died. Conversation thinned into silence, broken only by the music, brittle with tension. The ball that should have shimmered with laughter became a chamber of held breath. "Do you fear me?" His voice was low enough that only she could hear a growl wrapped in velvet. "Yes," she whispered before she could cage the word. "Good." A pause deliberate. "But fear alone will not keep you alive." The dance carried them across the floor in sweeping arcs. His palm pressed against her back, steadying her. But beneath that steadiness, she felt something coiled power. Yes, but also a restraint that was dangerous in its own way, like a blade sheathed not for peace, but for the promise of war. Why me? The question escaped her before she could swallow it. His eyes caught hers, grey, unyielding, reflecting no candlelight at all. Because no one expected me to. Confusion flickered through her chest, but there was no room for answers. He spun her outward, then back, drawing a murmur from the watching court. Even his defiance was a performance, and she was the stage he chose. By the final measure, her lungs burned. He released her only after the last note faded, as though to remind them all that the music itself ended at his command. The silence that followed was a thunderclap. Then came the bow. He lowered his head only slightly, not in respect, but in acknowledgement of his own victory. She trembling mirrored the gesture, the weight of hundreds of eyes scorching her skin. When they turned from the floor, whispers surged like a tide breaking its dam. She is nothing. An omega at the harvest ball. Has he lost his mind? Careth did not acknowledge them. He guided her with a hand firm at her elbow, leading her past the nobles and their brittle masks of civility. Some bowed reluctantly. Others refused, choosing stillness as rebellion. The air was a battlefield without swords, and every gesture a strike. Through the open doors of the hall the night awaited. Cold autumn air rushed against her cheeks, scattering the scent of perfume and smoke. The moon, swollen and pale, hung above the fortress towers, a silent witness to her undoing. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite the steel she tried to summon. "Home," he answered as though it were the simplest thing. But his home was a fortress carved into the mountain, a citadel where wolves bore no masks, and oaths were paid in blood. Liana's heart knew it already the moment his finger had pointed. Her life had been broken open, its path rewritten. She glanced back once. The glow of the great hall still spilled into the courtyard, golden and trembling. Within, the nobles would already be plotting, weighing alliances, sharpening rumors like knives. Her place among them, if she had ever had one, was gone. Ahead, the fortress loomed, black stone and iron gates etched against the night sky. His grip did not loosen, and though part of her longed to pull away, another part understood the step she took now was no longer hers to refuse. And so Liana followed the Alpha Lord into the dark, where the fate of outcasts and kings alike was decided not by birth, but by fire. The fortress swallowed her. Beyond the iron gates, the world of polished marble and candle-lit chandeliers ceased to exist. Torches guttered in sconces, hammered into raw stone walls, their smoke tracing black scars along the ceiling. The passageway climbed in narrow turns, a throat of rock leading into the mountain's heart. Every sound was amplified, the echo of boots, the clink of weapons, the rasp of breath that Liana could not steady. Careth walked ahead of her, his cloak dragging shadows behind him. He did not speak, and she did not dare to fill the silence. The weight of his presence was enough. At intervals, sentries straightened as he passed, their eyes catching her in swift, measuring glances before dropping away. She understood the look well enough. Why her? At last they emerged into a vast hall cut into the stone itself. The roof arched high, ribbed with beams of blackened oak. Fires blazed in 3 great braziers, spilling heat into the chamber, though the corners remained cloaked in shadow. Along the walls, banners hung in faded reds and greys, each marked with the sigil of the wolf rampant. The fortress breathed power, but it also reeked of old blood and iron discipline. Careth led her to a stair spiraling upward. By the time they reached the top, her legs shook with exhaustion. At a heavy door bound in iron, he paused, then pushed it open. The chamber inside startled her. It was not opulent like the ballrooms of the city, but it was spacious and coldly dignified. A bed stood against the far wall, its posts carved from dark wood. A table lay strewn with maps and half-burned candles. Armor rested on a stand scarred from use. This was no perfumed lord's retreat. It was the lair of a man who fought and expected to fight again. "You will stay here." His tone left no room for argument. Her heart jolted. "Here in your chamber for tonight." He unbuckled his sword and set it aside, metal striking wood with a note that quivered through her bones. "Afterward we will see." Liana wrapped her arms around herself as though the silk gown could shield her from the chill that seeped into her skin. "Why me?" she whispered again this time, unable to bite the question back. He did not answer at once. He removed his gloves slowly as though unpeeling layers of command. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were flint. "Because I watched you," he said, "and you did not know." Her breath stilled. In the market tending a child's fever. On the training ground binding the wounds of men who never thanked you. At the well when the nobles passed and you lowered your head, but your hand never trembled on the rope. You were overlooked because you do not fight for attention. Yet you endure. That is rarer than beauty. Rarer than birthright. His words struck harder than any insult, because they rang with a truth she had never wanted to admit she had lived invisible. And now he had dragged her into the open where the light was harsher than she could bear. Before she could form a reply, a knock rattled the door. A woman entered without waiting for permission. She was tall, broad-shouldered, her hair bound in a braid streaked with silver. Her armor gleamed even in the torchlight. Her gaze cut to Liana, lingering assessing, then returned to Careth with the ease of long familiarity. "My lord," she said, voice like gravel. "The council waits. Tell them they can wait longer." Her brow arched, but she did not argue. Instead, she turned back to Liana. "She will need a guard. Or a jailer. I will decide which," Careth replied. The woman's lips twisted, not quite a smile. "As you will." She inclined her head and withdrew, but the look she gave Liana before leaving was a warning. When the door closed, Liana pressed her palms against the table, steadying herself. "They hate me already," she said. "They will learn. And if they do not—" His eyes softened only slightly, a shade of storm easing, but never breaking. "Then they will burn." The brazier's flames cracked as though to punctuate his words. That night, sleep did not come easily. She lay on the edge of the great bed, the silk gown pooled like spilled water around her, while across the chamber Careth sat unmoving, studying the fire. She could not guess if he watched the flames or her shadow cast against the stone. When exhaustion finally dragged her under, she dreamed of wolves circling in silence, gray eyes, gleaming jaws, parted, not devouring, not yet, but waiting, always waiting. Dawn broke like a pale blade drawn across the clouds. Liana woke to the distant ring of steel and the measured tread of boots striking the yard below. For a moment she thought she had dreamed the ball, the dance the fortress, but the vast stone ceiling above her, the wolf crest carved in the beam, and the thick silence of the mountain air reminded her that nothing had been imagined. She was no longer a shadow at the edge of a harvest feast. She was here at the heart of a citadel that did not welcome her. Her chamber was cold but clean. Someone had left plain garments on a stool, a wool skirt, a dark tunic, a belt too wide for her waist. She stripped off the silk, folded it carefully, and slipped into the rougher cloth. It suited her better. Her fingers braided her hair into something serviceable, then found the latch. The corridor breathed smoke, bread, and iron. She followed the scent downward until she reached the kitchens where heat roared and knives kept time against boards. She lingered only a heartbeat before instinct pulled her forward, taking a knife, setting her hands to onions. No one asked who she was. That was mercy enough. It was mid-morning when a cry cut the rhythm. A stable girl stumbled in, clutching a bleeding hand. Liana cleared space without thought. Boiling water, binding cloth, stitching the skin shut with silk thread scavenged from her borrowed finery. Small bites, not long ones, she murmured to the wound out of habit. The kitchen stilled, watching. When she tied the bandage, she told the girl, "You'll hold reins by the next moon, not before." Gratitude shone in the child's eyes, and the room seemed to exhale at once. But the reprieve ended quickly. Commander Marin entered sharp as frost, her scar catching the torchlight. She studied the basin, the thread, the bandaged hand. "You were told to be cautious," she said. "I was told to step with care," Liana answered quietly. "A girl bleeding at the threshold is a line." Something unreadable flickered across Marin's face, but she gave a nod. "Next time the soldier's hall, not the kitchen." She turned to the cooks. See her fitted with cloth, not rags. By noon the story had spread like fire through dry grass. In corridors and courtyards Liana felt the shift in air, the stares sharper, the silences longer. She had crossed from invisible to noticed, and noticed was dangerous. It was then that the summons came. The council chamber smelled of maps wax and damp stone. Nobles ringed the long table, their gazes knives of different edges. At the head stood Carith, silent as carved granite. She entered, and the hush was heavier than stone. "Come," Carith said, making space beside him. She obeyed, though her chest was tight. An elegant man lounged across the table, wolf pelt white on his shoulders, smile sharp as polished steel. An odd choice, he purred, to pluck a forgotten girl from the feast and set her beside you as if she were... counsel. Varin Carith said, voice flat. Cousin Varin answered smoothly. His eyes slid to Liana. "What are you here, girl? A healer? A warrior? A toy?" He lifted a goblet, letting wine catch the light. "Toys belong in chests, not in council." Heat surged through her. She should have held her tongue. Instead she said, "Steady. I am what the Lord says I am, and I mend what breaks. That begins with flesh." A ripple spread through the room, half scorn, half surprise. Varin's grin widened, delighted she had stepped into his snare. "Hear that, cousin," she mends. "Perhaps she will stitch your throne when it splits under your weight." "Enough," Carith said. His voice did not rise yet. The word struck the room into silence. "She stands under my protection. Any tongue that tears her will answer to me." "Protection?" Varin echoed softly. "A strong word. It implies weakness. It implies law," Carith replied. "You will remember it." The council bent back to its maps, but Liana felt Varin's gaze on her like frostbite. When grain routes were discussed, she spoke once, warning that a flood would cut the road if they moved too early. Carith listened, and to the steward he said, 3 days. Delay." When the council dispersed, Varin lingered. He leaned close enough that only she and Carith could hear. A neat trick, he whispered. Predicting floods. They will call you witch next. And when they do, the trial is simple. Fire judges all. Then let it judge me, she answered before she could stop herself. Delight glimmered in his eyes. Oh, cousin, he said to Carith, hear that courage. It begs an altar. Not today, Carith said, his knuckles white against the table. Soon then, Varin murmured, bowing shallow enough to be mockery. He slipped away like smoke. The chamber emptied. Only Mairin, Carith, and Liana remained. Mairin's face was carved stone. Do not give him lines to pull. He delights in knots that cost skin to cut. He would have used any thread, Liana replied softly, if not mine, another's. Carith's eyes were on her grey and unyielding. He said nothing. But in the silence Liana understood she had not stumbled into a home. She had been dragged onto a battlefield, and every breath from now forward was a wager. Winter pressed its face to the mountain and fogged the arrow slits with its breath. In the days after the council, the fortress learned Liana's name in the way places learn a new sound first with startle, then with suspicion, and finally with a watchfulness that waited for proof. She moved as she always had toward where things broke. A cook's scald, a sentry's sprained wrist, a washerwoman's reopened cut, she bound them all, and when supplies ran thin, she boiled linen to reuse and traded kitchen favors for a jar of goose fat to ease cracked skin. Step by step she became familiar to those who once sneered. But whispers grow quicker than trust. Rumor said the river had flooded because she had willed it. Rumor said she bent Careth's will with herbs. Rumor said witch. The word crawled across the stone walls like ivy. By dusk, the rumors became law. Varin summoned her to the high shrine, cloaking his spite in piety. Old law demanded that the accused lay a hand upon fire. If she were guilty, the flames would consume her. If innocent, the gods would spare her. Carith raged against it. Mairin called it rot, but Varin smiled like a man certain of victory. The shrine was a narrow chamber of volcanic stone, its ceiling blackened with centuries of smoke. The brazier glowed a dull red, the coals banked but hungry. Priests stood stiff in ash-colored robes. The crowd pressed close, eager for spectacle. Liana stepped forward before anyone could touch her. She faced the coals, her body trembling but her spine straight. The priest asked if she submitted. She answered, I stand. She laid her palm flat on the fire. Pain came in a blinding surge, light without light, a shriek of nerves. She counted breaths. Not numbers, one for her mother's herb shed, one for the first child she had kept through fever, one for Frey's trembling lip, when fever broke, one for the river's rise, one for the stubborn hope that mercy could be fed like a small fire. The coals guttered. Heat dropped from agony to ache. The red dulled. Liana lifted her hand. Her skin was blistered but whole. The smell of scorched flesh was fleeting, fading in the draught. The crowd gasped. The priest faltered. Varin's smile cracked. Careth's voice rang against the stone. The gods guard her. Doubt her again, and you doubt them. Choose your blasphemy. No one answered. Not because they agreed, but because silence was the only refuge left. Later, when the crowd dispersed, Liana sat on the shrine's steps, dazed. Careth knelt beside her, binding her burn with linen, his touch careful for the first time. For a heartbeat, his bowed head rested over their joined hands. No command, only recognition. When she returned to the hall that night, faces turned differently. A guard touched 2 fingers to his brow. A kitchen girl whispered thanks. Respect, awkward and clumsy, had begun to grow, but so had fear. Varen's shadow lengthened, as Mairen warned her quietly. He will try another path now. Men like him do not stop. They circle. They wait for blood in the water. And Liana, staring at the white bandage wrapped around her palm, knew the fire had not ended anything. It had only begun the war. The smell of smoke still clung to her hair. Though 3 nights had passed since the trial, the memory of flame lingered in her skin as though her body had been branded by something deeper than fire. Liana woke often in the dark, heart racing, the ghost of heat rushing across her palms. Each time she forced herself to breathe slowly, to recall the faces that had watched her endure, some awed, some scornful, some secretly afraid. In the fortress, silence had changed its shape. Before it had been dismissive, the quiet granted to one too unimportant to notice. Now it was heavy taut, the silence of whispers swallowed when she entered a room. Servants lowered their eyes, but pressed closer to hear her footsteps. Soldiers paused in training yards, hands tightening on spears, as though her presence tested their resolve. Careth gave no explanation. He appeared at dawn and dusk, crossing the chambers with the same grave weight as always, speaking little. But his gaze had altered, no longer the gaze of one who had plucked an omega at random from a ball to make a point, but of a commander measuring what weapon he had unleashed. One evening, Mairen, the fortress's commander, summoned her to the upper courtyard. The air was brittle with frost stars crowding the sky like watchful eyes. "The trial won you breath, girl," Mairen said, her tone not unkind, but sharpened by warning. "But breath is not freedom. Varen will not rest. You must learn to walk the edge of a blade, or you will be cut down by dawn's light." Liana inclined her head. "I do not seek power. I seek only to heal." Mairen's mouth twisted into something like pity. "That is what makes them fear you most. Healing is power when the rest of us know only how to wound." The words haunted her as the days unfolded. Each time she bent to tend a wound, binding a soldier's gashed arm, grinding roots to ease the cough of a kitchen maid, she felt the fortress watching. The acts that had once been invisible, a woman's quiet duty, were now judged as weapons or signs of sorcery. Gratitude came in whispers hidden behind closed doors, while suspicion grew in council chambers. It was during one such tending that trouble found her. The great hall rang with the clash of practice steel when a boy no older than 15 stumbled bleeding from the yard, his forearm torn open by an ill-timed strike. Without thought, Liana seized linen, pressing firm, her voice calm, though the boy's sobs echoed. Blood slicked her hands. She worked quickly, stitching with precision honed through years of necessity. When she finished, the boy's breathing steadied, color returning to his face. Applause broke out sudden and sharp. Liana looked up to see not soldiers, but Varen himself leaning in the doorway, lips curved in a smile that did not reach his eyes. "How miraculous," he said, voice carrying through the hall. "Our little flame walker weaves flesh as though she were a goddess. Tell me, cousin." His gaze flicked to Careth, who had entered unseen. "Will she rule the fortress as well as she rules fire and blood?" The hall stilled. Liana felt the boy's weight lean against her trust, implicit in his exhaustion. She raised her chin, not daring to glance at Careth. I rule nothing, she said evenly. I mend what others break. If that offends, it is not me you fear, but your own hand. The words tasted like iron, and she braced for Varen's wrath. Instead, he laughed low and dangerous. Sharp-tongued for an omega. Careful, or they may test you with a sharper trial next. Kareth's voice cut across the hall. Enough. Just one word, but the walls seemed to hold it long after the sound had died. Varen inclined his head with mock courtesy and slipped away, yet the venom of his smile lingered like smoke. That night, Kareth came to her chamber. He did not speak of Varen, nor of trials, nor even of fear. Instead, he set upon the table a simple knife, its hilt plain wood. You cannot fight as they do, he said, but you must know how to survive when words and healing fail. She touched the blade, its edge catching the firelight. I am no warrior. Neither am I, he said softly, surprising her. I am a commander, and commanders endure by what others believe of them. His eyes held hers. You endured the fire. Endure this place as well. Not by matching their strength, but by refusing to bow. For the first time she wondered if his choosing her had been impulse alone, or if beneath the harsh stone of his presence, Kareth had seen in her something no one else had cared to look for. Liana lifted the knife. It felt awkward in her hand, yet steady, a symbol perhaps more than a weapon. She thought of Myron's words of healing as power, and of the boy who had trusted her to hold back death with needle and thread. Perhaps endurance itself was its own kind of blade. Snow came hard in the night, a steady whisper that turned the courtyard lamps to small moons hooded in frost. The fortress seemed muffled, as if the mountain itself had pulled a heavy pelt across its back. Liana slept little. When she did close her eyes, she saw again the brazier's coals dimming in her trial by fire, and she woke with her palm aching and the smell of smoke braided into her hair. By dawn the yard rang with steel and hoarse voices. The world's old rhythm had returned. Boots striking stone orders carried sharp in the cold, but it felt altered, as if the fortress itself remembered her ordeal and had shifted beneath it. Liana began the day with her herbs. She set her cedar chest where pale light fell, checking the careful labels, comfrey, marigold, yarrow, wintergreen, and ground a salve for her own hand. The burn still throbbed, but she welcomed its sting. A scar would come. She thought she might wear it like a seal pressed into wax proof of something endured. Frey came darting into the chamber, cheeks flushed from the wind, her hand bare. It healed, she said with fierce triumph. She flexed her palm to show the pink seam Liana had stitched so carefully. I'll braid my mare's mane today, just like you told me. Then braid it well, Liana answered, and Frey skipped away light-footed, as if the corridors had grown too narrow for her joy. The fortress brought its wounded to her, a bruised rib from sparring a baker's inflamed wrist, a veteran's knee that ached with the cold. Liana wrapped stitched, rubbed ointment warm between her palms. She spoke little, but her presence gathered notice. Whispers stirred again, witch-healer omen, each rumour dragging Varen's name behind it like a shadow. Then the horn sounded. Not the thin call of a watch change, but a deeper note, older, carrying a memory of war. The fortress tensed, as if every stone understood. Boots thundered, orders clanged. Maren burst in hair unbound. To the great hall she snapped. Now! "What is it?" Liana asked, already closing her chest. Varen Maren spat. "And those who mistake his smile for safety, he's chosen his hour." The great hall had shed its feasting tables, benches shoved aside. The banners of the wolf house swayed above, half hidden in smoke from the torches. Careth stood under them, sword drawn but lowered. His men lined the walls, loyalty etched, sharp but uncertain. Varen entered flanked by armored men whose cloaks bore fresh crests stitched overnight. His smile was practiced, gentle enough to be cruel. "Cousin," he called, voice smooth as oil, "yield and I will be merciful. Resist, and the stones themselves will cry out against you." "You mistake me," Careth said, sword tip resting on the stone. "I do not yield. I endure. They look the same at the start, very different at the end." The hall crackled with silence. Then blades clashed, sparks rising like startled moths. Soldiers broke from the lines, some to Varen, some to Careth, many still frozen by the weight of choosing. Maren moved swiftly, giving the hesitant men small tasks that tied their hands to defense rather than betrayal. Liana dragged her chest to the corner, claiming a space between the doorway and the wolf banner. She had no armor, only linen thread, boiled needles, and tinctures. But she knew this truth sometimes: a fortress is held not by walls, but by the stubborn promise that someone will be there when blood remembers to flow. The wounded poured in, a soldier with a gash across his shoulder, another with his brow split wide, a boy coughing blood where a spear had grazed his lung. Liana found her rhythm, pressure breath stitched high next. She sent Frey for water, the kitchen boys for cloth, a steady-handed guardsman to hold down a thrashing fighter. She did not falter. Above the roar she heard the ring of steel that meant Careth and Varen had found each other. She dared a glance, the Alpha Lord and his cousin circling blades, measuring each other in strokes that could end lineages. Careth fought like precision itself, every motion born of discipline. Varen fought like fire, quick, clever, eager to consume. A soldier fell hard before her table, bleeding from a wound beneath the ribs. Liana pressed her palms against it, blood seeping through her fingers. "Hold," she commanded. "Stay here. For Frey, who will braid her mare. For Cook Mari, who waits for her bread. For the boy who swims too long in the mill pond. For the road that will see your boots again." Hold. The man held. She stitched, tide turned him back to the world. Then a roar rose from the hall, not triumph, not grief, but the sound of inevitability. She looked up. Careth staggered. His blade fell. His back struck the wolf-carved pillar with a crack that shook the banners. Varen lunged, sword arcing toward his throat, the stroke of victory. No. The word escaped her raw, unplanned. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She ran. Time thinned. She saw Varen's blade flash downward. Careth twisted shoulder, catching the cut meant for his heart. Sparks leapt. Liana's hands seized Varen's wrist, not to stop but to pull. His balance shifted. Half an inch, no more. It was enough. Careth's free hand found Varen's dagger, wrenched it free, and drove it upward into the gap beneath his cousin's wolf pelt. The steel slid home. Varen gasped, eyes wide with shock fury, then silence. His blade clanged to the floor. Blood spread across the stone like spilled wine. He sagged, clutching at Careth as if to drag him down, but the Alpha Lord shoved him back. The hole froze. Silence leapt like a beast, pressing down on every shoulder. Men stared breathless as Varen crumpled against the pillar and slid into death. And in that silence, Liana stood between the two men, her bandaged hand stained again the mark of choice written on her skin. The fate of the fortress had shifted, and she had been its fulcrum. For a long breath, no one moved. Snow hissed through the arrow slits and melted on hot stone. Varen's blood crept in a slow, stubborn line toward the dais, darkening the grooves carved by generations of boots. Liana heard the whole's heart, the collective beat of fear, relief calculation stutter, and then find a new rhythm. She tasted iron on the air, and realized her mouth had filled with it, as if she had bitten through her own courage. Careth swayed. The cut across his shoulder ran deep where it had glanced from bone. Blood-beaded slid, and then poured faster when he tried to lift his sword. Liana moved without thought. She caught his arm, braced her hip against the pillar, and pressed her palm to the wound. Warmth slicked her fingers. His breath hissed through his teeth, not in pain, but in the simple recognition of living through something that had meant to end him. "Not here," he murmured, voice roughened. "Not before them. They can call it what they like," she whispered fiercely. "I will not lose you to their names." The silence shivered, then broke. Captain Joran's voice rang out first, beard clotted with snowmelt. "Stand to. If you bleed for the high march, you do not point your blade at its lord." A younger voice answered from the opposite rank. To Careth Helms turned. The undecided shifted like pieces on a board waiting for the tilt of a hand. Commander Maren stepped forward, sword point biting into a crack between stones. "Put down your arms," she said, her voice cold enough to carry. "The traitor is dead. If you would follow him, you will follow him into the dark." One man dropped his spear. Another knelt, palm pressed to the floor as if pledging to the keep itself. A handful bolted for the doors, but Maren lifted her hand, staying the archers. "Let them go," she said. "The hills will take their debt." Careth straightened under Liana's hand, jaw locked. He turned not fully, but enough for all to see his face, the blood and the steadiness that held them both. "High march," he said. The hall answered by stilling. "You have seen what would rule you, laughter over knives, mercy mocked as weakness. That ends. From this night the law is iron where it must be, and a hand where it can be. Any man still in love with the old cruelties may go and wed them in the snow." His gaze found Liana and did not leave. "Hear me. The healer stands under my shield. She is no curse, no witch, no toy. She is the fire that endured when death came. From this hour any who raise hand or tongue against her raise it against me." The words entered the stone like frost that splits rock. No one argued. Not because none disagreed, but because no one wished to teach their ribs the shape of defiance. Commander Careth said, "Secure the armory. Count what's ours, what's missing, and who looks too long at the floor." Maren moved the hall like a board of pieces, taking names, stripping insignia, sealing gates, setting watchmen at doors that had never needed them. The fortress groaned, stretched, and accepted its new shape, the way a body accepts a scar, unwilling but certain. Liana guided Careth to the long table. Men turned their backs to form a wall, offering privacy without admitting it. She cut his tunic, washed the wound, stitched a ladder of silk through protesting flesh. He watched her face, not the needle, and when the last knot was tied, he caught her wrist, not to command, but to still the tremor she had thought hidden. I am in your debt, he said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. You will pay it by living through the dawn, she replied. That night the dead were counted. Varen lay among them, destined not for crypts, but for the shallow earth outside the walls where traders feed the trees. Some protested, but no one defied Kareth's silence. Snow thickened toward midnight. Liana washed her arms in the soldiers' hall, then ate stew forced on her by Cook Marie. Keep him standing, Mari said. He has made us a promise, and promises are hungrier than wolves. Later, Kareth beckoned her to the balcony. The wind clawed at stone. The fortress slept uneasily. Varen will not be the last, he said. I know, she answered. Men who believe cruelty holds up the sky never go quietly to bed. He studied her weary but unbowed. They will call you equal today, curse tomorrow. Do you regret it? She thought long. No, I am tired of surviving without leaving a mark. Something in his eyes softened, though the wind shredded the moment. Tomorrow we name the traitors. The day after we send riders south. Then you sleep, she cut in. His mouth twitched. If you command. I do, she said simply. At the stair, a priest emerged from shadow robes whipped by wind. My lord, he said, what is to be done with the old trial? Burn the altar, Kareth answered. The priest blinked. And the people? Build them a place for healing, Liana said. A house of rosemary and soap, not char. The priest bowed deeper this time and left. Kareth looked at her a long while. Tomorrow stand beside me. Alone my words sound like force. With you like future. The truth of it chilled her spine, but she nodded. Morning broke the color of pewter. The hall swelled with bodies. Liana stood at Kareth's side, bandaged hand lifted as witness when he declared, the law of fire is ended. We will try men by deed, not by flame. The healer of this keep stands under my shield. If I fall, her word holds until I rise, or until a better man earns it from her. Let those who would test it come now. No one came. Some bent in their hearts already, others calculated costs. The fortress exhaled into a new order, wary but alive. Later, in the quiet of the herb room, Liana ground resin and whispered the old litany of leaves comfrey for knitting what should not be parted. Yarrow for telling blood to be brave but prudent. Marigold for persuading anger to cool into memory. Wintergreen for reminding ache it is not king. Her hands steadied. The fortress wounded had begun to heal. The fortress did not sleep for many nights. Men patrolled the walls with eyes hollowed by suspicion, every creak of timber or cry of owl twisting into threat. The kitchens burned longer stewpots never emptied because hunger made rebellion easier than cold steel ever did. In the stables, horses stamped and tossed their heads at every gust of wind. Even the dogs lay with their hackles raised. The high march itself had drawn in a breath, and did not yet know whether to exhale in peace or howl in mourning. Liana felt the unease in the marrow of the keep. Every corridor seemed to listen. Every hearth fire carried the weight of rumour. She stitched torn flesh, set splintered bones, pressed poultices to burns, and in every face she read a single question, unspoken. Will this hold, or will the stone crack again? Careth bore himself like a man carved from the same granite as the mountain, but she saw the weariness in the shadow of his eyes. His wound healed slower than his spirit allowed. By day he strode through councils. By night he clenched his teeth against fever. She pressed him to rest. He resisted, as though rest itself were another enemy to outlast. One evening, while she prepared a salve, Maren entered without knocking. Her armor was scuffed, her hair tied in a hasty knot. She watched Liana grind roots into paste before speaking. "You've done more than bind his skin," Maren said. "You've bound him to something that frightens half this hall more than treason ever did." "And what is that?" Liana asked softly. "Hope." The word hung heavy as a battle-axe. The naming of traitors came 3 days later. The hall filled with banners furled and spears upright, men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder. Careth's voice did not rise in anger, but cut with precision. He spoke each name as one draws a blade steady without flourish. Those named were stripped of insignia and marched to the gate. Some spat, some wept, some begged for mercy. But the gates opened all the same, and the snow swallowed them like the sea swallows wreckage. Liana stood beside him through it all, her burned hand resting against the cool rail of the dais. Eyes followed her, some with reverence, some with resentment. The mark she bore was no longer only hers. It had become emblem curse prophecy. She felt the weight, but did not lower her head. When it was over, silence ruled. Then one by one men thumped fists against their breastplates. Women bowed their heads. A murmur grew into a pledge, not shouted, not ordered, but given freely. Careth did not smile, but his gaze flicked to her, and she understood this was not his victory alone. The days that followed were a blur of mending. Smiths hammered through dawn to mend shattered gates. Servants carried ash from the burned altar, scattering it into the frozen river, so no ember of the old law might linger. Liana turned her herb room into a sanctuary of steady work. She taught kitchen girls how to brew fever teas, instructed soldiers in binding wounds without fear of infection, even coaxed Maren herself into learning a poultice for sprained joints. For the first time, healing became a craft respected rather than whispered. Men who once spat the word witch now sent for her when children coughed blood. Mothers left bread at her door in thanks. Still in dark corners, voices muttered that too much gentleness would soften the keep until it broke. She heard them. She chose not to answer yet. At night, when the fortress finally grew quiet, she and Careth would walk the ramparts. He asked her nothing of her past, and she offered nothing. Instead, they spoke of the future, of what might grow where cruelty had once been law. "Mercy is a thin shield," he said one night, staring into the endless dark of the valley. "It is stronger than you think," she answered. "It teaches men not to waste themselves in useless battles. And yet we will battle still." "Yes," she agreed. "But maybe fewer graves will be dug when the fighting ends." His hand brushed hers, rough and scarred. He did not take it, but he left it there, near enough that warmth bled between them. The first thaw came with blood. A raiding party from the eastern pass tested the fortress gates. Liana worked until her arms shook, binding gashes, whispering calm into fevered ears. When dawn broke, she stumbled to the courtyard to find Careth standing above the fallen snow, melting pink beneath his boots. He met her gaze across the carnage. For the first time, she saw him not only as lord or protector, but as man wounded, unrelenting, and uncertain of how to build something gentler in a world that devoured gentleness. She walked to him, pressed her palm against his uninjured arm, and said the only words that fit. "We are still here." It was not triumph. It was not consolation. It was a truth strong enough to hold the keep upright another day. By the end of winter, change had become undeniable. The fortress that once reeked of fear now smelled faintly of rosemary and boiled linen. The men joked that even ghosts might hesitate to haunt a hall so clean. Children ran through corridors, once reserved for war councils. Songs returned to the kitchen. Yet Liana knew the danger was not gone. Power had shifted, but envy, pride, and cruelty never slept for long. She carried that knowledge like a hidden blade, sharp enough to remind her each day that peace was not a gift but a labor, one she would bleed for again if need be. On the first night of spring she stood on the battlements beside Careth. The moon rose full over the mountains, silvering the snow into a sea of light. "Do you believe it will last?" he asked quietly. She thought of the herbs drying in her chamber, of the children's laughter, echoing off cold stone, of the scar that marred her hand, yet bound her to this place. "Yes," she said, "because we will make it last." And for once he did not answer with steel, but with silence that felt like assent. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to leave the mountains. Snow still clung to the shadowed slopes, but rivers ran swifter now, gnawing through ice with restless teeth. The fortress breathed differently in this season. The halls once filled with suspicion and iron silence now carried the scents of broth, fresh bread, and simmering herbs. Liana stood in the courtyard, where once she had trembled beneath the stares of nobles, and Omega pulled unwilling into the light. Today children darted past her skirts, laughing, their wooden swords clashing in mock battles. A few paused to eye the scarred hand she no longer hid. Instead of flinching, they whispered in awe, as though she bore not a wound but a banner. The old altar where the gods had demanded fire and blood was gone. In its place, masons had raised low stone walls around a garden bed where green shoots pushed through thawing soil. Soon herbs would grow there, sage, lavender, comfrey plants of healing rather than sacrifice. Soldiers came to help turn the soil, some awkward with the spade, others content simply to kneel beside her and listen as she named each seed. Their respect was not loud, but it was real-rooted in gratitude she had never asked for, yet quietly earned. In the great hall the banners of war still hung, but beside them now fluttered cloths dyed in softer colors, greens and pale blues that symbolized the river valleys below. The fortress no longer felt like a tomb carved into stone, but a dwelling where breath and laughter had space to endure. Careth moved among his people with a different bearing than before. His shoulders were still broad, his gaze still sharp, but there was less iron in the set of his jaw. He listened more, lingered longer in the kitchens, paused to watch the drill yard without barking commands. The scar across his shoulder, stitched by her hand, marked him as mortal, and perhaps that had tempered him. Some whispered he had grown gentler, others claimed the opposite, that he had grown wiser. Liana thought both were true. At night, when the fortress quieted and torches sputtered in their brackets, Careth would sometimes climb the battlements with her. They stood side by side, gazing out across the valley where moonlight lay silver on the rivers. He did not always speak, but when he did, his words were stripped of command. "I once believed strength was the power to make others kneel," he told her one such night, his breath clouding in the chill. But strength is endurance. It is the hand that keeps steady, even while the fire consumes it. His eyes flicked to hers, a rare, unguarded look. "You taught me that." Liana did not answer at once. She had no need to. She simply placed her scarred hand atop the stone, letting the moonlight catch the ridges of burned flesh. For the first time she felt no shame in its mark. The seasons turned. With spring came visitors' envoys from neighboring holds, curious to see whether tales of reform were truth or rumor. They arrived expecting weakness, only to find discipline, unbroken soldiers, loyal walls unshaken. Yet alongside the iron they found something new, a fortress that healed its wounded, a lord who did not demand fear, but service freely given. Some envoys returned home unsettled. Others lingered watching with keen eyes. Change always carried risk, but it was no longer a risk borne by Liana alone. One evening, as twilight bruised the sky, the council gathered in the hall, where once she had been accused, doubted, nearly condemned. This time she stood not at the center of suspicion, but at Kareth's right hand. From this day forward, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of stone, no child of these lands will face trial by fire. No healer will be branded witch for offering a balm. The strength of the High March will be measured not only in blades, but in lives preserved. There was resistance, of course, murmurs of tradition betrayed, of gods angered, but no one rose to challenge him. They had seen fire already, and it had burned away the old illusions. Liana looked out across the chamber and met the eyes of those who once turned from her. Some lowered their gazes, others held them steady. But none looked through her any more. She was no longer forgotten. That night she walked once more into the courtyard. The air was cool, fragrant with earth. Lanterns glowed along the walls. She paused by the garden bed, brushing soil from her fingertips. The green shoots trembled in the breeze, fragile yet unbroken. Kareth joined her quietly, as he often did, his presence a shadow at her shoulder. For a long moment they said nothing. The silence was not heavy now, but companionable, as if both knew words could only falter where truth already lived. "Does it feel like home yet?" he asked at last. Liana let her gaze drift upward to the towers, to the stars wheeling their ancient courses above. She thought of the night she had been pointed out a forgotten girl, dragged into the storm. She thought of fire, of scars, of the steady drum of her own heart that had carried her through each trial. "Yes," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "And more than that, it feels like a beginning." His hand brushed hers, not as a command, but as an offering. She did not flinch. The fortress slept on around them walls, standing hearths, glowing lives stitched together from ruin and hope, and in the quiet heart of it all stood an Omega who had once been forgotten, now remembered, now unshakable, whose endurance had turned even fire into seed.